Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This podcast is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, a new online collection of practical, trusted resources made for those who support global missions from home. Visit us online at globalmissionstoolbox.com to register for access to this growing collection of tools for senders. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. I'm here with our co-host, Maddie DeSmit. Hi, Maddie.
Hi, Megs, and hi to everyone who's tuned into this episode.
We have a really courageous conversation today, Maddie. Do you know of the book When Helping Hurts?
I do. It's such a good one and has resonated with so many people. I definitely enjoyed reading it several years ago.
I think there's going to be some resonance in the same spirit as that book today with this conversation. It was one that gently and graciously challenged us and even our good intentions, but made sure that we were still learning forward. And I think that's going to apply today when we talk about family-based care for children in need.
Mm-hmm. And Ellie does bring this conversation to us in such a clear and concise and gracious way. So I think our listeners are going to be very helped by it. And as you listen to this episode, you'll hear that there is a great need for advocacy about this topic of family-based care for children in need. So as you listen and as you learn today from this conversation, we encourage you to consider who you could share these ideas with, whether there's family or friends in your life that you can bring this up to, or perhaps for consideration with your church's missions committee, or perhaps you could share this episode on your social media. Now we invite you to listen to this great conversation with Ellie Oswald.
Our guest today is Ellie Oswald, who serves as the Executive Director of the Faith to Action Initiative. This is an initiative which helps educate and mobilize churches and faith-based organizations and individuals on best care practices in considering orphans. It's a global initiative, and before her role here at Faith to Action, Ellie served as Director of Mission and Outreach at Bethany Community Church out in the West, Seattle, Washington, and she also served with World Vision in Child Development and Rights Technical Team. I'm curious what that means, Ellie. I'm going to ask you. She specialized, though, in community-based care for children deprived of parental care. Ellie, welcome to the Global Missions Podcast.
Thank you, Max. It's so good to be here.
Let me track back and just ask what that means. World Vision's Child Development and Rights Technical Team. What does that mean?
It was an awesome team. Essentially, World Vision has this global center that our job was to be able to look at programming across all of the countries that World Vision works in and really assess if it was reaching the most vulnerable kids. And when it wasn't, to pilot new programs. And so it was just an interesting place to be, to really critique and get better at the good work that World Vision is already doing.
Very good. Interesting. Well, we are looking forward to this. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think it will be inspiring to our audience. Just so we get to know you a little bit as we begin, how did you become passionate about caring for orphans and about children in need?
Yeah, since I was in high school, I wanted to help people. I wanted a career that made a difference, and kind of went on that track, minored in college in nonprofit, went to seminary and studied international development, got a job at World Vision, ultimately was a missions pastor. But honestly, it was really when I had my first child that deep, driving motivation hit me, as my son cried at night. We went to him and we comforted him. And when he was scared or embarrassed as a toddler, it was my neck that he buried his head into. And yeah, I'm getting choked up early in this. That's really where this went beyond just a desire to make a difference to a heartfelt calling. And when I recognize that so many children don't have that, I can't help but want to be every day a part of helping children find and thrive in safe and loving families. So it really was the experience of being a mom that has motivated me in this work.
Well, it's a beautiful vision and so closely woven to your own heart. Thank you. Now, we are going to talk about the organization that you do serve with now, Faith to Action. Please just introduce us to this as well and how these fit together.
Yeah, we are a bit unique because we aren't running any programs on the ground. Essentially, we're a coalition of, Christian organizations who come together to try to elevate best practices in global orphan care. So, like you said, we focus on educating and mobilizing others, especially Christians in North America. So we have educational resources and trainings. We spend time coaching and supporting people in their own efforts to support orphaned and vulnerable children. Specifically, we believe as a coalition that the evidence has proven that children grow best in the love and care of families. And so our goal is to make that family care approach the globally recognized best practices for meeting the needs of orphans.
Okay, very good. Well, we are going to learn a little bit more about the Faith to Action initiative. I want to mention the website right here at the outset of this program or this episode, faithtoaction.org, all one word, Faith to Action. And then there is a button there. You'll find it in the middle on my screen. It turned green. It's Start Here. And that is a place where I was able to learn quickly about this organization. And then you can branch out from there to learn, of course, more of the specifics that they have to offer there. Ellie, as we speak to this audience of the Global Missions Podcast, many of them are church leaders who are already passionate about missions. Why is our conversation today about caring for orphans so important?
It's a good question. Having been a missions pastor, I get there are so many things that we need to respond to, and today is even more challenging. But this scripture is just so strong in this area. Over and over, we see this scriptural mandate to care for the orphan. And we see God's heart for the orphan, In Isaiah, it talks about our role to defend the cause of the fatherless. And in Psalms, some of my favorite, Psalm 68 talks about God as a father to the fatherless and a defender of the widow. And then it says that he sets the lonely in families. And just over and over, we hear this calling. And the church has been responding to the calling since the very, very early days of the church. Christians used to take children who'd been abandoned outside the city walls, take them into their home and nurse them back to health and raise them as their own. So Christians have always played a really important role in care for children who are outside of safe families. And they need to continue to do that. I know we will. But, I think applying these scriptural mandates, as I've called them, in our own ministries today is a bit more complex. And in fact, we need to kind of address some of the really common misconceptions or the kind of problematic mindsets that can lead us astray when we're trying to respond to what the Bible is telling us.
Yeah, it's really good as a foundation. If we stay just in the early ideas here, the causes, some of the things, Ellie, why is it that children end up in orphanages? Some of it's probably really obvious, but just take us back to what's happened that we have this problem.
Yeah. I mean, our best estimates at this point say that, 5 to 8 million children are living in orphanages today, but that number is probably a lot higher than that, and more added every day and more age out. So a huge amount of children are experiencing what we call residential care, which would be orphanages and children's homes and the likewise. The biggest kind of misconception that we have is that these children are orphans. We think an orphanage, they must be orphans. And the truth is that globally, 80% of children in orphanages have a parent. Data is from around the world, but some UNICEF data show that 77% of children in Cambodia orphanages had a parent, and in Sri Lanka, it was 90%. So we see just globally, the average is about 80%. And even those children who maybe don't have parents who could care for them, the vast majority of children in orphanages have other relatives who could care for them if they had support to be able to do so. So, children aren't in orphanages because they're orphans per se. In fact, most children who are actually orphans live in families right now. So it's really important, that question that you're asking. So why? Why are they there? And there are a lot of reasons, but poverty is almost always the underlying cause. We talk about poverty plus. It's actually a term I borrowed from Bethany Christian Services. So poverty plus is this idea that a poor family has some sort of crisis that leads them to a situation where their child is placed in an orphanage. Maybe it's illness in the family. Maybe a child's born with a disability, or, a disability becomes more and more challenging for a family to respond to. Addiction, of course, or even in some cases, just an inability to provide education for children. So I guess in short, children in orphanages, not because they're necessarily orphans, but because their families they're poor and they're struggling to care for them.
It's really helpful to me because I didn't realize the numbers were anything like that, really. But to hear you describe what really is a broader problem, it's not just the absence of a parent through death or some other tragic situation, but a whole bunch of other societal challenges that the outcome is that these children are in this vulnerable state.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And unfortunately, I think it's led to way too many situations where parents have had this impossible choice in front of them, like between caring for their own child in their own home or sending them to an orphanage to receive food or shelter or education, the things that they feel like they're not able to provide. So it's a choice we really never want a parent to have to make, because we see from research over decades that residential care, orphanages and children's homes, it's not having the kind of impacts and outcomes that we really are hoping and wanting to see when we support those kind of ministries. We see that kids who spend, especially a long amount of time, or maybe when they're younger, spend time in those settings, they struggle with their own brain development. There was a study that said for every 3 months, they found that a child was in residential care, they lost a month of normal development. It affects their ability to have healthy relationships as adults. It can really have these increased risks. Like we see higher percentages of unemployment of adults who spent time in residential care, higher rates of homelessness, more risk of exploitation into really dangerous situations. And really, really common is just the serious mental health issues that come as children move into adulthood. So, research has really kind of proven what we all know, that children need families for their ability to have a healthy development. And they need that love and bonding and attachment that I sensed, when I was holding my own child. And they also need a sense of identity and belonging that only a family can provide. And that's why this situation is so challenging.
Wow. Well, we are recording this in February of 2022. So I want to ask a time-bound question here as well, Ellie. We're starting to emerge from some of the limitations of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're not out of it yet by any means, but I wonder if you could just comment how this pandemic has impacted children in need.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the risk factors that lead to children being placed in orphanages, those are only increasing in the wake of COVID-19. And it's tough because we have seen before this a decrease in so many of these areas. For example, the World Bank is now estimating 140 million children are going to fall into poverty due to COVID. And we've actually seen decline over more than a decade in extreme poverty. So now we're seeing this big jump, which is not good. World Vision's done some really interesting research as well over the last 2020 and 2021 of families that they serve. And they're seeing, loss of jobs being a huge impact. And then that leads to food insecurity. And that leads to kids, working instead of going to school. And, when school was interrupted, some kids never coming back. So that leads to things like early marriage and teen pregnancy and all of these things. Nobody's just guessing. World Vision is learning this from the programs on the ground. And so it's what we call an kind of this slow onset disaster. Usually we see disasters and the news and like immediately see the impact. But with COVID, especially families in poverty, this is a crisis we're seeing roll out slowly, and it will continue for years and years. So it's really important that now more than ever, we of the church are uniting to respond and support families in this really tough time.
Well, we're going to pivot to look forward in just a minute, but you just mentioned the church there. And so I'd like to ask this as we try and help, what are some of the complexities that we as the church face when it comes to caring for children in need?
Yeah, I think it's really important for us to recognize the role that, especially if I'm mostly, most of us are from North American churches or kind of from that donor side, is to recognize the role that we play kind of in this system that's been a bit misaligned. And sometimes when we talk about the reasons children end up in orphanages, I like to think about push and pull factors. So there are push factors, meaning like the negative things that are impacting families. So this is poverty, this is death, this is violence in the home. But then there's also pull factors that bring children to orphanages. And this is things that are provided in the orphanage that bring children towards the orphanage. So, access to education, access to, quality food and nutrition and special services for children with disabilities. And so when you start to think of those two categories, you kind of, as a kind of this donor side of the church, start to recognize that maybe, if we recognize that there are children in orphanages that could potentially be families, but we're directing our support towards inside the orphanage, that's something we can think about and really consider.
You've said it very well there. I think you're pointing to where good intentions don't always lead to the desired outcomes. And there are some occasions even where our good intentions are counterproductive. You said it very nicely.
Yeah, I think it feels a lot of doom and gloom at this point. But what is good, though, is that we have solutions and we've learned some lessons over the years. And there are alternatives to the way we've maybe thought we should be doing the things. And there's lots of good things happening.
And here's where we will pivot. We've sort of seen the situation and some of the seriousness of it, the depth and the breadth of it. There are some alternatives. What are the alternatives to orphanages, Ellie?
Yeah, put simply, it's family. You probably picked that up already, but that means a lot of things. It means biological parents for sure, but it means kinship care, which is care by relatives, aunts, uncles, grandparents, even neighbors or church friends, and then foster care and adoption when a child genuinely can't be cared for with their relatives. And ultimately, the best way to meet the needs of orphans is to strengthen the capacity of families to care for them. And I think we really have to expand our idea of what orphan care means or what, orphan ministry means. Genuinely, orphan ministry is anything we can do to strengthen vulnerable families to make sure that they're empowered to care well for their children. That is orphan care. And I think if we can make that switch and expand that definition, we will be better aligned with the genuine needs of children.
It's a great point, very strongly made. What about children who have no parents and no family? What happens then?
Yeah, and that is a very common question that I hear every day, right? But I think hopefully the stats we shared, we recognize that this is more rare than we realize, that someone would really have nobody. But there are times, more commonly, when a child's family is just not safe for them to be in. And in those situations, that's where these family-based solutions come from, and that's national level foster care and domestic adoption. Those are great opportunities for us to be able to ensure that children not only have access to this authentic family space where they're receiving the kind of attention they need, but also it allows kids to maintain their own unique identity and to stay connected with their culture. So there's incredible leaps and bounds happening in countries around the world to develop these alternative family care systems like foster care and adoption.
Well, this has been so helpful to set the stage, Ellie. In just a few minutes, I'm going to talk with Ellie about some practical steps and advice that she has for churches in North America and how we can be helpful in caring for children in need. Before we get to that part of the conversation, we'd like to share this missions resource, and we hope it'll be helpful to you and your church.
Empowered by Christ's heart of compassion, we share what we've been given and what we've experienced to change tomorrow by what we do today. We are you. We are business people, accountants, engineers, writers, IT specialists, videographers, mothers, agriculturalists, doctors, teachers, social workers. Put your faith in action and walk with us as we bring life and hope to the peoples of Asia and the Arab world. Go to innerservecanada.org to learn more. And now, back to today's discussion.
We are back with Ellie Oswald, the Executive Director of the Faith to Action Initiative. And so far, we've talked about sort of some of the factors that lead to a child being in a vulnerable place, how they might be in an orphanage, and many of them still do have family. And there are some alternatives, especially based in the family. Ellie, many of our listeners are from North America or in places far away from these children in need. What is the role of the North American church now in caring for children in need?
Well, I think that's a very important question that many people are asking right now, because I don't think we realize how important and significant we are in responding to the needs of orphan children around the world. First off, North American Christians specifically are major supporters of orphan care globally. And specifically, we are major supporters of orphanages and other kind of residential care models around the world. Really, a huge part of this story is during the AIDS epidemic. Christians were the very first to respond to what was called, AIDS orphans at the time. And it was an incredibly generous response. But the response focused almost solely on building orphanages or international adoption. Both have their place, but this did lead to what I call a proliferation of orphanages. And that just means the overuse or the misuse of orphanages, where children who were in those spaces weren't necessarily needing to be in those spaces. And what we know is that orphanages should actually be the very last option for the child. And instead, because of the support and funding that was coming in, we saw them becoming the first stop for children. And that kind of legacy has continued on today. Faith to Action worked with the Barna Group, who does great research, to survey U.S. Christians last year, and just to get a sense of their thoughts and support for residential care. And I keep using that term in place of orphanages or children's homes. But shockingly, they found that $2.5 billion every year goes from individual U.S. Christians, not even church budgets, not even foundations, but just individuals, mostly writing little checks every month for like a sponsorship program, to residential care. $2.5 billion. I did not know what to do with that when we got it back. We also found that about 21% of people who go on mission trips visit orphanages while they're on them. So the support is incredibly generous and well-meaning, but it may be causing harm that we didn't really realize. But the good news is we have better solutions now. We've learned those lessons and we know what works for children. We can make a significant impact if we shift this huge amount of support to programs that help families in crisis stay together or place children within loving new families when that is really necessary.
Well, very, very helpful. And you've been gracious again, as we were saying, that good intention and the desire to help and the desire to be generous hasn't always led to the best outcomes. So we keep learning forward. Now, I'm wondering about just getting practical and some advice that you may have for us, especially, for example, from North America, and how churches can better help care for vulnerable children now.
Yeah. Well, I think first we can resolve to be educated donors, and just the 15 years I've been in real active missions work, it's just amazing to see, especially the Church in North America, rise up and really be willing to be critical of what we are doing and to get better and to grow and learn, and just encourage people to do that in this space, lay on the concepts of empowerment and sustainability that we've come familiar with in missions now, and consider what that means for orphan care. Make decisions about giving or going that are aligned with best practices in orphan care. And what is best practice is family-based care. So just taking time to be educated and then considering how you can align your support. And then also, we have to commit to spreading the word about this. This is a cultural mindset that orphans need orphanages, and it's just so prevalent in our culture. But it does not take a lot for people to get, oh, wait, yeah, what orphans actually need is family. But until we address that mindset, we're going to continue pushing back when progress is trying to be made in countries around the world. So it's important that us Christians tell our friends and family and other churches what we're learning and sharing that word. And we're here to help with that. That is essentially what Faith to Action is trying to push and support. But it could be as simple as telling somebody about what you listened to today and saying, do you want to learn about this more with me? We need more advocates, more people sharing about this. And then finally, it's prayer, especially in these times where COVID is really impacting families, hitting them really hard. We need to be in prayer for those families so that they, and for their children, so that they continue to or find ways to improve the way they're caring for those kids, because we know that it can put children in really vulnerable places. And God is ultimately one who is leading this effort, and we get to join in. So just prayers for those children, their families, and the request for God to show us how we can step in and be part of his good work in responding to their needs and the pain that they're feeling.
Really helpful to have practical steps like that. Thank you. Part of our family's experience in missions, Ellie, included Eastern Europe, and we served in Ukraine for a season. And some of our team members, especially, were involved closely in the orphanage program there and helping particularly young women as they were transitioning from the orphanage into adulthood. I just wonder if you could take us with you to see an example or two of where you've seen the church doing a great job of caring for children in need.
There are so many examples. And again, I've been in this space for a decade or so. And what's really exciting right now is there are so many examples to draw from. And there wasn't 10, 20 years ago. So this really is a growing movement of Christians around the world who are trying to take this family-based approach to orphan care. And you mentioned Ukraine, and it's really interesting because that has been an area where the rest of the world has been learning from some progress that was made in Ukraine. Specifically, there was a group that came together. It was Christians who came from many different spaces, some in the government, some in media, some from the church, a lot from the church, and gathered together to look at the problem of orphanhood in Ukraine. And together they made plans, they unified around a message. And years later now, we've seen some real progress, especially in their work to expand foster care and adoption there. So we're seeing an openness and sharing of just the success of people doing foster care and adoption. And actually, the leaders of that group, Ukraine Without Orphans, some incredible people, that vision was kind of caught by others. And now there's this group called World Without Orphans. So it moved from Ukraine Without Orphans to World Without Orphans. And it's essentially this network of faith leaders in their country, maybe work in media, work in the church, work in other places, that gather together for what they call radical collaboration to solve the orphan crisis in their countries. This movement now is huge and so encouraging. You can check it out, World Without Orphans, on their website. But, it's not the story's not over for Ukraine. There's always more to do. But I think right now what we're seeing is a desire to work more on the prevention, really preventing kids from being placed into the system, as we might call it, So work to intentionally strengthen vulnerable families. So we aren't seeing kids go into residential care or even foster care who really their issue is poverty and their families wants to care for them, but really getting more services that can strengthen families. But it has been a really helpful there's been a bit of a microscope on Ukraine over the last few years to really see how things are progressing and how other countries can learn from it.
Excellent. Oh, I'm delighted to hear that even a place where I've been personally familiar, just a blessing to hear how that's growing forward there, and the body of Christ is helpful.
Yeah, I think it's helpful too to have examples of, because, that's happening in Ukraine. I mean, almost really, just those faith leaders in Ukraine, but as in, churches like myself who are out here in the West, in the North American church, there's some really incredible examples of partnership as well. For example, the church that I used to work for has a great group in Costa Rica who runs these holistic centers for children in some of the roughest neighborhoods around San Jose. And you're like, oh, great, cool, a child center. But that's orphan care, right? This is expanding the definition of orphan care, because that center for many single moms in that area who really struggle to be able to work and care for their children, because in Costa Rica, children are normally going to school half day. If the center wasn't there, they either wouldn't be able to work or they'd have to leave their children alone in a neighborhood that's really violent and dangerous. And so they would be at risk of their children being removed. And so this church in Seattle, Washington, has a financial contribution, but also is just learning from what that partner is doing. They visit every year to encourage the staff to build those relationships, to learn about the work. And then they also collect stories and information that they come back and share with the congregation, so that the congregation is involved in learning. And it's been really interesting and encouraging to see that the congregation in Seattle is getting more and more involved in supporting vulnerable families in their own community. They just started the Safe Families program. And that it really was because there's this mutual learning going in these cross-cultural relationships where we're seeing both sides of the partnership growing in their ability to strengthen families to support their children really well.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned it, because you just took the next question, right? Answered the next question. I wanted to ask about the impact sort of here in North America. And we see a healthy, positive feedback loop coming from that area where, in this case, Costa Rica, but there's great blessing coming back to the senders as well. Very rich interaction. Ellie, if our listeners would like to learn more about this topic, what do you recommend for resources?
Well, not to toot our own horn, but, Faith to Action exists to try to be a bridge between some of this technical or kind of deep kind of academic research about what we're learning is best for kids and to people who want to do what's best for kids. So just visiting our website and seeing that we have a variety of resources that can help organizations, whether you're trying to figure out how you can do short-term mission trips that will support best practices in orphan care, or if you have a partner that is doing residential care and you want to consider what it means as a donor, or even yourself if you're running orphanages, what it means to kind of consider what would happen to transition. We have resources to help people transition from orphanage care to family-based care. Just encourage you to check it out and follow where you feel like maybe you need to be acting or learning.
Mm-hmm. Well, don't mind you tooting the horn. I'm going to do that too. And just say again, on the website, there's a heading at the top, Learn. And there are a variety of resources there that will just help us expand our understanding. Some of this is very current. Ellie mentioned the Barna research just a year or two ago, over the last couple of years. This is relevant and fresh. It's current. And for those of you who may be serving on a missions committee or serving in a leadership role at your church, this is the type of material that can really positively influence the help that we're bringing. We had an episode with Brian Fickert when we talked about how to help without hurting. It was way back. If you want to hear that episode, it was number 17, by the way back in the first season. We do want to help without hurting, and there's some great ideas here about how we can increasingly do that with vulnerable kids. Ellie, if any of our listeners would like to contact you further or Faith to Action, how could they best do that?
Yeah, we would love to connect. I mean, that's what we're here for. So probably the easiest way, just email us at info@faith2action.org. Follow us on social media. We do a lot. We post a lot there. But yeah, we're here to help. And if you want help, just reach out.
Super. Now, my last question is one that I really like to ask at the end of a conversation like this. If were standing in front of the missions committee of a faithful local church, the pastor is probably there. These are folks who really do want to do a great job, a healthy job of missions, both locally and globally. What would you like to say to them?
Yeah, I think I would just like to encourage them that we, if I can put myself with them, we can be a difference. And I'm not just talking about a difference for one child or even a group of children, but we, the local church, the donor local church especially, can make a real difference in turning the tides in this global movement. You know, when it comes to changing the way we care for orphans, the reality is, in a lot of ways, the train has left the station, if I can use an allegory. The UN just released the UN agreed on a resolution that every country essentially in the world has said that they will prioritize family-based care and that they will end the institutionalization of children. So governments are beginning to move towards implementing that, some more than others. The train has left the station. And my question and my prayer really is really around, where will the church be on that train? Because we're on it if we're caring for kids, and we are caring for kids. You know, will we be the caboose kind of resisting the momentum and maybe even sliding the brakes a little bit, you know, holding on to, you know, the ways we've always done it? Or could we actually be the headlight of that train, because we have the vision in Scripture, in creation? God created family as a means for raising children. We have that vision. And so sharing that vision will allow us all to move more quickly in the direction where we see more and more children growing up in safe and loving families. And that's my prayer, is to recognize our little piece isn't really that little, and that we can step up and eventually, I mean, I think soon, and we already are being known as leaders in this effort to see children thrive in families.
Well, it's really good. It's a great challenge to us. Would we like to be the caboose or closer to the front of the train? A really good way to put it. Ellie, this has been informative and it's been inspiring. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Global Missions Podcast.
Thank you. It's been so great to be with you.
Well, Maddie, there was our courageous conversation with Ellie.
It was such a courageous conversation and so helpful.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we hope each person listening to this interview is that you'll identify something that you'd like to last, to take away in your mind and heart. Of course, Maddie and I have the benefit of articulating it a bit here, but we hope you'll do the same. Maddie, what's one thing that you'd like to take away from our conversation with Ellie?
I think what I will take away from this conversation is that despite the challenges in this area, there is progress that's being made. And Ellie did such a great job of highlighting some of the encouraging stories and changes that are taking place in regard to care for children in need. And so it takes away the level of impossibility that sometimes can be felt and just brings to mind again the ways that God is working in this area. And I think it's encouraging too to see that churches are responding to the need of children, and even governments and other organizations are taking an opportunity to be a part of change in this area. So I'm very encouraged by that.
That's good. It's not all bad news. There's some really good stuff too. My takeaway is going to be this simple idea of kinship care. Ellie really helped me expand my thinking about a child who may have a parent or immediate or extended family who might do a better job of caring and raising a child if they had support to do so. And so that idea of supporting the whole family through kinship care was something that really was helpful to me, and I'm going to take it away today.
Good one. Well, we'd like to thank everyone for listening to this episode and remind you that this episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, an online collection of resources especially for senders, pastors, missions committees, and family and friends of workers sent to serve in missions. We invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.